The office had emptied hours ago, but Daniel Brooks remained at his desk. The blue glow of his monitor cast long shadows across the cubicle walls. He wasn't working overtime for ambition or recognition. He was simply waiting for Malene Cross to finish reviewing the quarterly reports because she'd asked him to stay. And when the CEO asks, you stay. What he hadn't expected was for her to appear at his desk, phone in hand, a rare uncertainty flickering across her features. She needed help with her dating profile, she said. Just technical feedback, nothing personal. Daniel nodded, keeping his expression neutral as he scrolled through the carefully curated images and precisely worded descriptions. After a long moment, he looked up and told her the truth. The profile was too polished, too controlled. It read like a resume, not an invitation. Malene stared at the screen for several seconds, then lifted her gaze to meet his. The smile that crossed her face was nothing like the measured expression she wore in boardrooms. It was softer, almost vulnerable. "Why not take me out?" she asked quietly. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, not because of the words themselves, but because he understood instantly that something fundamental had just shifted between them, and there would be no pretending otherwise. Daniel Brooks had spent the better part of his adult life perfecting the art of restraint. At 36, he'd learned that knowing when to step back was often more valuable than knowing when to push forward. This philosophy governed everything from his approach to fatherhood to his conduct at Mercer and Holden, the investment firm where he'd worked as a senior analyst for the past 4 years. His mornings began early before his 7-year-old daughter Emma stirred in her bedroom down the hall. He would brew coffee in the small kitchen of their 2-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, reviewing market reports on his laptop while the sky lightened over the Manhattan skyline visible through their window. By breakfast time, he was preparing Emma's meal, usually scrambled eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes if it was a weekend or if she'd had a particularly rough day at school. He'd learned to read her moods from the way she shuffled into the kitchen, the angle of her shoulders, the brightness or dimness in her eyes. Single fatherhood had made him fluent in a language that most men never had to learn. Emma's mother had left when their daughter was 2, not dramatically, not cruelly, just decisively. She'd realized, she said, that she wasn't built for this life, this smallness, this routine. Daniel had watched her pack her suitcases with a numbness that took months to thaw into grief. By the time the grief arrived, he was too busy changing diapers and warming bottles to fully inhabit it. Perhaps that was a blessing, or perhaps he'd simply learned to compartmentalize so effectively that certain rooms in his heart remained permanently sealed. At work, Daniel was known for his precision and his discretion. He spoke in meetings only when he had something worth saying. He never lingered at office happy hours, always citing Emma's bedtime as his reason for leaving early. His colleagues respected him without really knowing him, which suited Daniel perfectly. Connection, he'd learned, came with complications he couldn't afford. Malene Cross existed in an entirely different stratosphere. At 41, she'd built Mercer and Holden from a struggling boutique firm into a financial powerhouse with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. Magazine profiles described her as brilliant and ruthless, a combination that seemed to fascinate and terrify the business world in equal measure. What they rarely mentioned was the loneliness that accompanied such singular focus. Daniel had observed her over his years at the firm, not with romantic interest, he would have insisted, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on reading the room correctly. He noticed that she stayed later than anyone else, that her corner office light was always the last to go dark. He noticed that men who tried to charm her invariably retreated within weeks, and that she attended industry galas alone, despite being one of the most sought-after names on invitation lists. She was, he realized, surrounded by people who wanted something from her, whether access, influence, or the prestige of association. What she lacked was someone who saw her as simply a person, complicated and uncertain and searching, just like everyone else. Their interactions had been minimal before that evening. Quarterly reviews, occasional strategy sessions, the polite exchanges of 2 people who orbited the same professional space without truly intersecting. But Daniel had noticed something in those brief encounters, a quality in her attention when she listened to him speak. She didn't just hear his words. She seemed to weigh them, to consider them with genuine interest. It was subtle enough that he might have imagined it, yet something in him recognized it anyway. When she appeared at his desk that night with her phone extended, Daniel understood that she was showing him something she rarely let anyone see. The woman behind the title, uncertain and searching and tired of performing strength. He could have deflected with a joke. He could have offered empty reassurance. Instead, he told her the truth because he suspected she hadn't heard it in a very long time. What Daniel hadn't anticipated was the invitation that followed. Nor had he anticipated the sudden, unmistakable certainty that he was standing at a threshold he'd spent years carefully avoiding. The dating profile glowed on the phone screen between them, and Daniel found himself studying it with the same analytical precision he applied to market trends. 3 photographs. Malene in a tailored blazer at some industry event, Malene on what appeared to be a yacht in the Mediterranean, Malene standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office with the Manhattan skyline sprawling behind her. Every image projected success, power, unassailability. Every image, Daniel realized, was designed to intimidate. He scrolled to the biography section. The language was equally formidable. Seeking intellectual equal with global perspective, must appreciate fine dining, cultural institutions, and stimulating discourse. There was a list of requirements that read more like job qualifications than dating preferences. Advanced degree preferred, international travel experience, familiarity with contemporary art and classical music. You wrote this to filter people out, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet in the empty office. Not to invite them in. Malene's expression flickered, a brief crack in the composed facade she wore like armor. Efficiency matters in dating as much as business. Why waste time on incompatible candidates? Candidates? Daniel set the phone down on his desk. You're not hiring a vice president. You're looking for a partner. Is there a meaningful difference? The question landed with more weight than she'd probably intended. Daniel considered his response carefully. When I interview candidates, I'm evaluating their qualifications against predetermined criteria. When I was dating, before I was looking for something I couldn't quantify. Chemistry, comfort, the sense that someone saw me, not my resume. Malene was silent for a long moment. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed suddenly loud in the stillness. Men are intimidated by me, she said finally. They approach with confidence, learn who I am and retreat. The ones who stay want access or validation, not connection. I thought if I set the bar high enough, I might attract someone capable of meeting it. Or you might ensure that no one tries. The words hung in the air. Daniel half expected her to bristle, to reassert the professional distance between them. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, regarding him with something that looked almost like curiosity. You're suggesting I've constructed barriers unconsciously. I'm suggesting your profile reads like a warning label. Approach only if you're confident enough to survive scrutiny. Most people, even accomplished ones, don't want to feel like they're being evaluated. They want to feel wanted. Malene's gaze drifted to the window, to the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. And what would you suggest instead? Write it like you're a person, not a position. Mention the things you love, not the credentials you require. Let someone imagine sitting across from you at breakfast, not negotiating a merger. The silence that followed was different, charged with something Daniel couldn't quite name. When Malene spoke again, her voice was lower, almost uncertain. Would you help me rewrite it? Not as an employee, just as someone who clearly sees things I've missed. Daniel knew he should decline. Every instinct honed by years of careful boundary maintenance screamed at him to retreat to the safety of professional distance. But something in her question, something vulnerable and genuine, made refusal feel like cowardice. All right, he said, but we do it honestly. No curated perfection, just who you actually are. For the first time since he'd known her, Malene Cross looked genuinely surprised. And beneath the surprise, something that might have been hope. They began that night, sitting side by side at Daniel's desk, the glow of his monitor casting soft light across their faces. Malene had pulled a chair over, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that he couldn't identify. He tried not to think about that. Tell me about your mornings, Daniel said. Not the ones where you're running a company, the ones where you're just existing. Malene frowned slightly. Most of my mornings involve running a company. Before that, before the emails and the calls, what's the first thing you do when you wake up? She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel watched something shift in her expression, a softening around the eyes that he'd never seen in boardroom settings. I make tea, she said finally. Earl Grey, very strong with a little honey. I stand at my kitchen window and watch the sunrise over the park. Those few minutes before the world starts demanding things from me, they're the only peace I have most days. Daniel typed, mornings start with strong tea and stolen moments of silence. What else? I read, not business books, novels, old ones mostly. Edith Wharton, Henry James. I know it's cliche for someone in my position to gravitate toward stories about society and status, but I find comfort in language that doesn't rush. He added, find solace in old novels and unhurried prose. What about dinner? He asked. What's your ideal evening? Malene laughed softly, a sound he realized he'd never heard before. You'll think it's ridiculous. Try me. I like to cook simple things, pasta mostly. I put on music, something quiet, and I take my time chopping vegetables. There's something meditative about it. The rhythm of the knife, the smell of garlic and olive oil. She paused. I've never told anyone that. It seems so ordinary, so beneath what people expect of me. Ordinary isn't beneath anything, Daniel said. It's what makes someone real. He typed, happiest with homemade pasta and music playing low. As the evening wore on, they uncovered other details. Malene loved thunderstorms but hated cold weather. She'd wanted to be a writer when she was young, before pragmatism and family pressure redirected her toward business school. She found small talk exhausting but could discuss philosophy or literature for hours. She was terrified of vulnerability, of showing anyone the soft underbelly beneath her armored exterior. And Daniel, listening to her revelations, felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. Not attraction exactly, though that was certainly present. Something more unsettling, recognition, the sense that beneath all her achievements and his careful boundaries, they understood something fundamental about each other's loneliness. By the time they finished, the profile read like a completely different person. Gone were the demands and qualifications. In their place was a portrait of a woman who loved quiet mornings and old books, who cooked pasta when she needed to think, who was searching not for a partner who could match her accomplishments, but for someone who could sit with her in silence without needing to fill it. Malene read it 3 times, her expression unreadable. This doesn't sound like a CEO, she said finally. That's rather the point. It sounds vulnerable, exposed, like I'm inviting strangers to see the parts I've spent decades protecting. You asked for honesty. This is honest. She set the phone down slowly, and when she looked at him, her eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or hope, or some complicated mixture of both. You see me differently than anyone else, she said quietly. I'm not sure if that's terrifying or wonderful. Daniel should have reminded her that he was just an employee offering feedback. He should have wished her luck with her dating prospects and returned to his work. Instead, he held her gaze and spoke the truth. It's probably both. The new profile went live the following morning. By afternoon, Malene had received more genuine responses than she'd gotten in the previous 3 months combined. Men wrote paragraphs about their own love of quiet mornings. Women, responding to her selection for both genders, shared their favorite novels and asked about her pasta recipes. The wall she'd carefully constructed had been replaced by a window, and strangers were peering through it with genuine interest. Daniel knew this because she told him. She appeared at his desk during lunch, phone in hand, scrolling through the messages with an expression caught somewhere between amazement and terror. This is overwhelming, she said, and they're all so sincere. I don't know how to respond to sincerity. You could start by being sincere back. She looked at him then, and something in her expression made his chest tighten. You make it sound simple. It's not, but that's never stopped you before. Over the following days, Daniel watched from a careful distance as Malene navigated this unfamiliar territory. She replied to messages, arranged coffee meetings, even went on what she described with characteristic understatement as preliminary encounters. He tried not to think about her sitting across from strangers in upscale cafes, offering them the vulnerability she'd revealed to him. It wasn't his place to think about it. He was an employee who'd helped with a personal project. Nothing more. Whatever connection they'd formed that night was circumstantial, born of late hours and unusual intimacy. It would fade. Except it didn't. Malene began finding reasons to speak with him, questions about quarterly reports that didn't really require his input, requests for his opinion on matters far outside his job description. She'd linger at his desk after delivering these pretexts, and their conversations would drift into personal territory. She told him about the dates she was going on, how the men were perfectly nice, perfectly appropriate, and perfectly wrong, how she kept comparing their conversations to the ones she'd had with him that night. They say the right things, she said one evening, perched on the edge of his desk while the office emptied around them. They're successful, articulate, attractive, but talking to them feels like reciting lines from a script. There's no spontaneity, no friction. Friction isn't always comfortable. No, she agreed, but it's honest, and I've discovered, rather inconveniently, that I've developed a taste for honesty. The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Malene, Daniel began, but she raised a hand. I know the complications. Believe me, I've cataloged them extensively. You work for me. There's an inherent power imbalance. Any relationship would invite scrutiny and speculation. She paused, her gaze steady on his face. But I've spent my whole life avoiding complications. And where has it gotten me? Alone at 41, asking an employee to help me seem more human on a dating app. You are human. That was never the problem. Then what is? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the city sparkled with indifferent light. When he spoke, his voice was low. I have a daughter. She's the center of my life. Everything I do is filtered through what it means for her. I can't afford to make decisions that might destabilize our world. And I represent destabilization. You represent unknown variables, possibilities that could go wrong in ways I can't predict. Malene nodded slowly, and he saw something shift in her expression. The vulnerability she'd shown him was still there, but it was joined now by determination. Then let me be specific, she said, not as your employer, just as a woman who hasn't been able to stop thinking about you since that night. She met his eyes. Would you take me to dinner? Not a date, not a commitment, just a meal. Two people getting to know each other outside these walls. Every rational part of Daniel's brain screamed objections. But beneath the caution, beneath the carefully constructed defenses, something stirred that he'd almost forgotten existed. One dinner, he said finally, and we see where it goes. They met at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, somewhere far enough from the office that the chance of running into colleagues was minimal. Daniel had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on dark jeans and a button-down, casual enough to signal that this wasn't a formal occasion, presentable enough to show respect. Malene was already seated when he arrived. She'd abandoned her usual power suits for a simple blue dress that softened her edges. Without the armor of professional attire, she looked younger, more approachable, almost uncertain. I wasn't sure you'd come, she admitted as he sat down. I wasn't either. They ordered wine and appetizers. The conversation began hesitantly, both of them navigating the strange territory between professional acquaintance and something more personal. But as the evening progressed, the awkwardness melted. Daniel found himself telling her about Emma, about the small rituals of their life together, about the guilt that still crept up on him when he couldn't provide her with a mother's presence. Do you blame her? Malene asked quietly. Emma's mother? Daniel considered the question. I used to. Now I think she did us a favor, leaving when she did. Better to have one fully present parent than two who are half absent. He paused. I worry sometimes that I've used her departure as an excuse, a reason to avoid getting close to anyone again. Protection masquerading as principle. Something like that. Malene nodded slowly. I understand that more than you know. My entire career has been built on convincing myself that achievement could substitute for connection. That if I climbed high enough, I wouldn't notice how alone I was at the top. The vulnerability in her voice made something shift in Daniel's chest. This wasn't the polished CEO who commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors. This was a woman stripped of pretense, admitting that her success had come at a cost she was only now beginning to count. You're not alone right now, he said quietly. No, she agreed. They didn't touch across the table, didn't make declarations or promises, but something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of possibility that neither had allowed themselves to consider before. When they left the restaurant, the night air cool against their faces, they walked in companionable silence for several blocks. At a corner where their paths should have diverged, they stopped. This doesn't have to be complicated, Malene said. I know we said no commitments, no labels, but I need you to know that I'm not looking for casual amusement. Whatever this is, I want to approach it with intention. As do I. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. Then we'll figure it out, step by step. Daniel nodded, and when he walked home that night, he realized he was already wondering when he could see her again. The office had always functioned as a carefully ordered ecosystem, hierarchies established and respected, relationships professional and appropriate. Daniel had navigated these waters successfully for 4 years precisely because he'd never disrupted them. Now, in the days following their dinner, he felt the fragility of that careful order. Nothing had changed visibly. He arrived at his usual time, performed his usual duties, exchanged the usual pleasantries with colleagues, but everything felt charged with a current that hadn't existed before. When Malene passed through the main office, he was acutely aware of her presence. When their eyes met briefly across a conference room, he saw something private flicker in her expression. He suspected others noticed too. The confirmation came later. Daniel was leaving a coffee shop near the office when a colleague, Marcus Chen, fell into step beside him. Saw you at that Italian place last week, Marcus said casually, with Cross. Seemed like quite the dinner. Daniel kept his expression neutral. Business discussion. She wanted input on a client's strategy. Right. Marcus's tone suggested he believed nothing of the sort. Listen, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but you should know people are talking. The late nights, the private conversations, speculation is the company's unofficial pastime. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. There's nothing inappropriate happening. I believe you, but perception matters as much as reality around here. Just thought you should know the landscape. By the time Daniel reached the office, his mind was already calculating the potential damage. He'd spent his career being unremarkable, dependable, beneath notice. Now, suddenly, he was the subject of speculation. And not just speculation about him, but about Malene, whose reputation was infinitely more visible and consequently more vulnerable. That evening, he requested a private meeting with Malene. She met him in her office after hours, when the floor had emptied and discretion was possible. People are talking, he said without preamble, about us, about the time we've been spending together. Malene's expression remained composed. I assumed as much. Gossip is inevitable. This isn't just gossip, it's perception. And perception affects everything from your authority to my career prospects. What are you suggesting? Daniel had rehearsed this conversation during the walk to her office, but now, facing her, the words tasted like ash. I think I should request a transfer to the Singapore office or London, somewhere far enough that the speculation dies naturally. Malene was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. You would leave, give up everything you've built here, because of whispers. I would leave to protect you. Your position is precarious in ways mine isn't. A female CEO involved with a subordinate, the narrative writes itself. I won't be the reason your accomplishments are overshadowed by scandal. So your solution is retreat, distance, the same strategy you've employed for every emotional complication in your life. The words landed with unexpected force. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. That's not fair, isn't it? Malene stepped closer, her eyes searching at his face. Tell me honestly, Daniel, are you leaving because you're worried about my reputation? Or because this is becoming real, and real terrifies you? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he could give. Because the truth, the honest, unvarnished truth, was that both were true. He was worried about her, but he was also afraid. Afraid of wanting something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally. I've spent years building walls, convincing myself that solitude was safety. And now you're standing on the other side, and I don't know if I remember how to let someone in. Malene's expression softened. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm with a gentleness that felt almost foreign. Neither do I, she said, but running away won't teach either of us. It will just confirm that we were right to hide. What's the alternative? Stay and let the rumors consume everything we've worked for? The alternative is that we face it together, openly, honestly. We establish boundaries that satisfy propriety while acknowledging what we've become to each other. She paused. Unless you've decided that what we've become isn't worth the risk. Daniel looked at her, this woman who had built an empire through sheer force of will, now standing vulnerable before him, asking him to be brave. And he realized that running had never actually protected him. It had just delayed the inevitable reckoning with his own capacity for connection. It's worth the risk, he said quietly. You're worth the risk. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had before. There were no pretenses, no strategic calculations, just two people finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the fears that had governed their lives. Daniel sat across from Malene in the leather chairs that usually hosted high-stakes negotiations. Tonight, the stakes were different, personal in ways that made professional achievements seem almost trivial. I need to tell you something, he began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Something I've never admitted to anyone. Malene waited, her expression patient. When Emma's mother left, I was relieved. Somewhere beneath the grief and the anger, there was relief, because it meant I didn't have to keep trying to be something I wasn't. I could focus entirely on Emma, tell myself that fatherhood was enough and never risk failing at partnership again. He paused. I've spent years convincing myself that I chose solitude. The truth is, I was hiding from the fear that I wasn't enough, that anyone who saw the real me would eventually leave, just like she did. Malene absorbed this in silence. When she spoke, her voice was soft. You're afraid of being seen. I'm afraid of being seen and found wanting. She nodded slowly. Then we have more in common than I realized. She took a breath. I've never told anyone this, but there was a man years ago before Mercer and Holden became what it is now. We were engaged. He knew me when I was still struggling, still uncertain, still human. Her voice wavered slightly. When the company started succeeding, when my name started appearing in magazines, he couldn't handle it. He said I'd become someone he didn't recognize. He left, and I learned that success was a form of armor that kept people at a distance. So you kept succeeding. I kept succeeding, and with each achievement, I became a little more untouchable, a little more alone. She met his eyes. When you told me my dating profile was a barrier, you were describing my entire life. I've constructed myself into someone no one can reach. The confession hung between them, raw and undefended. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the walls he'd built, admitting light he'd forgotten existed. What if we're both wrong, he asked. What if the things we think make us unworthy are actually the things that make connection possible? You're suggesting that our brokenness is an asset. I'm suggesting that pretending to be whole is exhausting, and maybe the only real intimacy comes from letting someone see the fractures. Malene was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, crossing to where he sat and lowered herself to the arm of his chair, close enough to touch, though she didn't. I'm scared, she admitted, of wanting this, of believing it could work, of having it fail and proving that I was right to stay armored. I'm scared too. Then we're both terrified, which means we're perfect for each other, or we're making a spectacular mistake. Despite everything, Daniel laughed. The sound surprised him, loose and genuine, a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding. Spectacular mistakes are underrated, he said. Malene smiled, and something passed between them that felt like permission. Permission to try, permission to fail, permission to be imperfect and uncertain and still worth choosing. Whatever happens, she said, I want you to know that meeting you changed something in me. You showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that being known might actually be worth the risk of being hurt. And you showed me that hiding isn't protection. It's just loneliness with better marketing. She laughed at that, a real laugh that transformed her face. We're going to make this up as we go, aren't we? I think that's the only honest way to do it. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. What passed between them was more significant than physical affection, an agreement to be brave, to be honest, to face whatever came together rather than apart. In the weeks that followed, Malene worked with HR to restructure Daniel's position. He was transferred to a different division, one that reported to a vice president rather than directly to her. The move was presented as a strategic reallocation of talent, nothing more. But within the office, the message was clear. Whatever existed between them was no longer a conflict of interest. They continued meeting outside of work, dinners at quiet restaurants, walks through Central Park on weekends, conversations that stretched for hours, revealing layer after layer of who they were beneath their professional personas. Daniel introduced her to Emma gradually, first as Dad's friend Malene, then as someone who came to dinner occasionally, then as a fixture in their small kitchen, helping Emma with homework while Daniel prepared meals. Emma, with the uncomplicated wisdom of childhood, accepted Malene without the reservations adults might have expected. She asked good questions, Emma reported after one of their sessions. Not like other grown-ups who just want to tell you things. She actually listens. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding his breath, waiting to see if the two most important people in his life could coexist. One evening, as Malene was leaving after dinner, Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Like for keeps?" Malene knelt to Emma's level, her expression serious. "I don't know what for keeps looks like yet, but I can tell you that I like being here with you and your dad, and I'm not planning on going anywhere." Emma considered this. "Okay," she said finally, "but if you make my dad sad, I'll be really mad." Malene nodded gravely. "That's fair. I'll try very hard not to." Daniel watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, feeling something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the simple recognition that his life was expanding beyond the careful boundaries he'd maintained for so long. After Emma was in bed, he walked Malene to the door. They stood in the hallway, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "She approved of you," Daniel said. "That's not nothing. She warned me not to hurt you. That's more significant. She's protective. Gets it from her father." Malene smiled, reaching up to straighten his collar, a gesture both intimate and casual. "We're really doing this," she said, "building something together. It terrifies me." "Me too." Her smile widened. But terror is just excitement without confidence, and confidence can be learned. He kissed her then softly, the first time they'd allowed themselves that particular vulnerability. When they pulled apart, her eyes were bright. "Same time next week," she said. "I'll cook." "You'll cook," she agreed. And then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Daniel alone with the extraordinary realization that he was no longer afraid to want more. Summer softened into autumn, the city's fierce heat mellowing into crisp mornings and golden afternoons. Daniel had stopped counting the weeks since that first dinner, stopped treating each meeting with Malene Jerez a novelty that might evaporate without warning. Somewhere along the way, she had become an expected presence in his life, and that expectation carried its own quiet miracle. He was still cautious by nature, still the man who triple-checked logistics and anticipated obstacles before they materialized. But he was learning that caution didn't have to mean isolation, that opening his life to someone didn't require abandoning the careful architecture he'd built. Malene was learning her own lessons. She still ran Mercer and Holden with the same fierce competence, still commanded boardrooms and negotiated deals that made headlines. But something had softened in her edges. Colleagues noticed, though most couldn't identify exactly what had changed. She smiled more readily. She asked about people's lives rather than just their deliverables. She left the office before midnight most nights. One evening in late autumn, they sat together on Daniel's couch, Emma asleep in the next room, the city glowing through rain-streaked windows. Malene's head rested on his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. "I deleted the dating app," she said quietly. Daniel felt a smile tugging at his lips. "Any particular reason?" "I found what I was looking for." She turned to look at him. "Not a profile or a checklist or an optimized match. Just a person. Someone who sees me as I actually am and chooses to stay anyway." "Sounds like quite a discovery." "It was, though I had help." She reached up, tracing the line of his jaw. Thank you for telling me the truth that night, for being brave when I wasn't, for showing me that connection doesn't require perfection. Daniel turned, capturing her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Thank you for asking me to take you out, for being willing to risk everything you'd built for something uncertain, for teaching me that hiding isn't the same as safety. We taught each other. We did. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that felt almost musical. Inside, wrapped in warmth and quiet understanding, two people who had spent their lives preparing for solitude discovered something neither had expected: the extraordinary relief of no longer being alone. They had made no grand declarations, exchanged no promises of forever. They were too aware of life's unpredictability for such certainties. But what they had built, meeting by meeting, conversation by conversation, vulnerability by vulnerability, felt more solid than any proclamation could have been. It was a foundation laid not on romance, but on honesty, not on passion, but on patience, not on the fantasy of perfect compatibility, but on the daily choice to show up and be known. Daniel thought of the man he'd been just months before, the one who worked late to avoid going home to an empty apartment, the one who told himself that wanting more was dangerous. That connection led only to loss. He barely recognized that man now, not because he'd changed fundamentally, but because he'd finally allowed himself to be seen. And being seen had revealed possibilities he'd refused to acknowledge. Malene shifted against him, her voice drowsy with approaching sleep. What are you thinking about? The profile, he said. The one we rewrote together. What about it? We said we wanted to make you sound like a person, not a position. Make you real. He paused. I think we succeeded. Malene smiled, her eyes closing. We did, she agreed, though it turns out the profile was never the point. The point was you, reading between the lines, seeing what I was too afraid to show, being patient enough to wait for me to catch up. Daniel pulled her closer, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. The waiting was worth it. Yes, she murmured. It was. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion. Inside, two people who had once defined themselves by their barriers drifted into sleep together. No longer protected, no longer alone, finally willing to be exactly who they were. And somewhere, abandoned and unnecessary, a dating profile gathered digital dust. Its careful words no longer needed now that its author had found something no algorithm could have provided. A person who chose her not for what she represented, but for who she truly was. In the quiet glow of the late-night office, Daniel Brooks, a guarded single dad, and Malene Cross, the formidable CEO armored by success, discovered that true connection blooms not from polished perfection, but from raw, unfiltered honesty. For years, Daniel had hidden behind careful restraint, convinced that vulnerability only invited loss after his wife's departure left him raising Emmy alone. Malene, meanwhile, had built an empire on intimidation. Her dating profile a fortress of demands designed to keep everyone at bay, fearing that showing her softer side, quiet mornings with tea, homemade pasta, old novels, would make her seem less powerful. When Daniel gently dismantled that facade, rewriting her profile to reveal the real woman beneath, she didn't just find better matches, she found the courage to ask him out. Their journey teaches a heart-wrenching yet beautiful lesson. The walls we build to protect ourselves from hurt often become the very prisons that keep out love. Letting someone see your uncurated self, your fears, your ordinary joys, your imperfections, is terrifying, but it's the only path to genuine intimacy. Daniel learned that solitude isn't safety, it's just loneliness in disguise. Malene discovered that strength isn't in being untouchable, it's in choosing to be known anyway. In a world obsessed with curated lives and flawless facades, dare to be real. The right person won't run from your truth. They'll stay because of it. If Daniel's quiet bravery or Malene's vulnerable, why not take me out, touched you, if it reminded you of a time you hid your real self or finally let someone in, share that moment in the comments below. Your story could inspire someone hesitating on their own threshold. And if these tender tales of courage, healing, and unexpected love warm your heart, please subscribe. More stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary connection are awaiting. We'd be honored to share them with you.